You know, it's really fascinating how the idea of home is shifting for so many people these days.
It really is.
There's this real push towards simplifying, living with less clutter, and often that starts right with the house itself
Absolutely.
and the tiny house movement.
Yeah.
Well, it's been gaining steam since, what, the late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah.
It seems to really resonate with that desire.
It definitely taps into something. The basic idea is compelling, isn't it? A home that's just significantly smaller than what we think of as traditional.
Right. How small are we usually talking?
Well, the sweet spot seems to be around 100 to 300 square feet often. But, they can be smaller or sometimes a bit bigger, maybe up to 600 square feet.
Okay. And the appeal is pretty clear.
Yeah, lower cost is a big one. Plus, potentially a lighter environmental footprint. And for a lot of people, it's a route to a more intentional way of living.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we really want to unpack that. What exactly is a tiny house beyond just small? And crucially, if you're listening and thinking this sounds interesting, how do you actually legally make it happen?
That's the key question.
We're going to look at the US, then jump over to Europe, the UK, France, Germany specifically, and maybe even touch on Turkey. Because what's immediately clear from the research is, well, the rules are all over the place.
Completely different depending on where you are. So whether you're just, curious or maybe wondering about the practicalities, the costs, the legal hurdles, or even seriously considering it.
Yeah.
Our aim here is to give you a clearer picture of what's involved.
So getting back to the basics, what defines it? What makes a house tiny besides the square footage?
Fundamentally, it's about that deliberate reduction in living space paired with wanting a simpler lifestyle.
Okay.
It's interesting. In France, we found this official government definition. They call it a lightweight habitat.
Lightweight habitat.
They describe it as demountable, so it can be moved, and linked to a lifestyle focused on, I think the terms were sobriety and autonomy.
Sobriety and autonomy. That's quite specific.
It is. And what's also interesting is they say this definition isn't just for tiny houses as we might picture them. It can include things like yurts, caravans.
So it's more about the philosophy, the simple, mobile living aspect.
That seems to be a big part of their definition, yes. The underlying lifestyle choice.
That makes sense. It's not just the structure, but the intent behind it.
Yeah.
Now, within tiny houses themselves, there are different ways people go about it, right? Different types.
Oh, definitely. You've got the mobile ones built on trailers, on wheels.
Those seem pretty popular. What are the costs like?
In the U.S., the average seems to be somewhere in the $50,000 to maybe $76,000 range, ballpark. Plus the cost of the trailer itself, which adds another, say, $5,000 to $9,000.
Okay. And what are the catches with mobile ones?
Well, a big one is they're often treated as personal property, not real estate. So that can mean dealing with personal property taxes.
Ah, right.
And the other major headache is finding a legal place to actually park it long term. That can be really tricky.
Okay, so that's mobile. Then you have stationary ones, built on foundations.
Exactly. Those tend to average a bit differently in the U.S., maybe $40,000 up to $105,000, depending on size and finish, of course.
And legally, they're treated differently.
Generally, yes. In the UK, for example, if it's on a foundation, it's basically treated like a traditional house when it comes to planning permission and building regulations.
Yeah.
Much more permanent in the eyes of the law.
Got it. Then there are prefabricated options.
Yep, prefabs. Those have a huge price range. We saw figures from as low as maybe $9,500 up to over $150,000.
Wow, that's a massive range.
It really is. The upside can be speed. They can be built faster. But the downside is usually less customization. You get what they offer.
Versus a fully custom build.
Right. Custom built gives you total control over the design, every little detail. But that control comes at a price, usually $50,000 to $175,000, maybe more. It really shows the trade-off. Speed, control, cost.
And the final category, conversions. People turning sheds or buses into homes.
Yeah, the DIY approach, very creative, can be cost-effective sometimes, but you definitely can't skip the paperwork.
Meaning permits.
Permits, inspections, you need to make sure it's safe and meets zoning rules. Like in the UK, converting a bus. You'd probably need to get it re-registered officially as a camper van to live in it legally.
So it's not necessarily a shortcut around regulation.
Not at all. So looking at the U.S. averages again, across all types, you're maybe in the $28,000 to $86,000 range. But like we said, location matters hugely. New York versus Texas. Very different costs.
In size, obviously.
And size. The average cost per square foot seems to hover around $290 in the U.S.
Okay, so lots to weigh up. financially and structurally. What about the bigger picture, the pros and cons of the whole lifestyle?
Well, the pros usually mentioned are things like minimalism, living with less stuff,
Mhm.
potentially lower ongoing costs, utilities,
And
maintenance,
flexibility too, if it's mobile.
definitely location flexibility with mobile homes, and often a smaller environmental footprint.
And the downsides.
The obvious one is less space. That's a major adjustment.
Yep.
Then there are the zoning restrictions we keep mentioning that can be a huge barrier.
What else?
Resale value can be uncertain. And getting financing or insurance, that can sometimes be challenging because they're still seen as non-standard housing.
Okay, let's zoom in on the USA then. If someone listening is in the States, what's the biggest legal challenge they'll face?
Without a doubt, it's zoning laws.
Right.
These rules dictate how land can be used, and they vary incredibly from town to town, county to county. It's hyperlocal.
And the key issue within zoning is,
How the tiny house is classified. Is it seen as an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU, which might be allowed in someone's backyard under certain rules?
okay,
Or is it classified as a recreational vehicle, an RV, which usually means it's restricted to RV parks or specific campgrounds?
now that classification makes all the difference for where you can put it.
Absolutely. You see states like California, which have become somewhat more open to ADUs recently. Then you might have a state like Georgia with much tighter rules. Figuring out that local classification is step one.
It really boils down to where you want to be, doesn't it? Are things generally getting easier for tiny houses in the U.S., regulation-wise?
There's definitely momentum. Advocacy groups are pushing hard to get tiny houses recognized as legitimate, affordable housing options.
Making progress.
Some, yes. We've seen states like Maine, for instance, update their laws to be more accommodating. Advocates are talking to city planners, trying to ease those restrictive zoning rules.
And tiny house communities, are those helping?
They can be. Sometimes they find areas with more flexible zoning, or they work together as a group to navigate the rules or even push for changes locally.
That makes sense. Power in numbers.
And it helps to keep highlighting the benefits, right? Lower resource use, lower bills. The potential for off-grid living is also a factor. Solar panels, for example.
What's the cost for something like that?
For a typical residential solar setup, you're probably looking at somewhere between, say, $4,250 and $11,900. So it's an investment, but feeds into that self-sufficiency idea.
Right. So community and advocacy seem key in the U.S. Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic. The U.K., what's the legal story there?
In the UK, the big headline is, you almost certainly need planning permission.
Okay, so no, just setting one up in a field.
Definitely not legally. And beyond planning permission, building regulations are crucial for safety and quality. Inspections are standard.
And does it matter if it's on wheels or a foundation in the U.K.?
Yes, the specific requirements under building regs can differ, but unlike the US, where an RV classification might offer a different path, in the UK, pretty much any structure intended for dwelling needs to meet standards.
So what kind of standards are we talking about? Building regulations cover what?
Well, there's the Building Safety Bill emphasizing structural soundness. Then the regulations themselves cover key things like fire safety, that's Part B, insulation for energy efficiency, Part L ventilation, Part F electrical safety, Part P. It's quite comprehensive.
Sounds like a proper process. How does it work? Do you apply first?
Typically, yeah. There's a pre-planning stage, figure out your design, talk to the local planning authority, then you submit detailed plans to get building regulations approval.
And they inspect during the build.
Yes, at key stages. Foundations, insulation going in, plumbing, electrics. And then, if all goes well, you get a final completion certificate at the end.
Can you start building before you get full approval?
Sometimes after you've given initial notice, you might be able to start certain aspects, but the inspections will still happen, and you need that final sign-off. It's not a way to bypass the checks.
Makes sense, especially for safety. What about green building? Is that part of UK regs?
It's definitely encouraged. Regulations push for sustainable materials, water efficiency, that's Part G, energy efficient heating, and using renewables. You'll likely need an energy performance certificate, an EPC rating showing how efficient the dwelling is.
Sounds like you'd want some professional help navigating all that.
Oh, almost certainly. Architects, builders who know the regs, maybe even legal advice. It's complex.
Okay, let's move south of France. We mentioned their lightweight habitat idea earlier. How does that play out legally?
The key thing in France seems to be the intended use of the structure.
How so?
If it's designed to be demountable on a trailer, meant to be lived in more than 8 months a year, and potentially self-sufficient for water and power, then specific rules kick in.
And what are those rules?
Well, if the total floor area is under 40 square meters, that's about 430 square feet, usually just a prior declaration to local authorities is enough.
Just a declaration, not a full permit.
Often, yes, for one unit under that size. But if you plan to have two or more on the same plot, and their combined area is over 40 square meters and they're meant as permanent homes, then you likely need a full development permit.
So size, permanence, and number of units matter. What if it's just temporary, like setting one up for the summer?
If it's installed for less than 3 months, generally no permit or declaration needed.
Okay. And they actually mention self-sufficiency in the regulations.
They do, yeah. The possibility of being 100% off-grid for water and electricity is acknowledged, which seems quite forward-thinking.
But there must be places you can't put them.
Oh, absolutely. Big restrictions apply. Agricultural land, protected nature areas, places where camping is banned or restricted to official sites, classified forests and parks. Those are usually off limits.
But you really need to check locally.
Always.
Yeah.
Check with the town hall, look at the local urban plan, the PLU, and they also consider landscape integration.
Meaning how it looks?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Especially in historic town centers or areas with really distinct natural beauty, they want it to fit in visually.
Despite the rules, is France generally becoming more open to these?
It seems so, partly driven by the housing crisis and this push for more sustainable, affordable ways to build. There appears to be a growing acceptance.
Interesting. Okay. Germany. Our research suggested that's a tougher nut to crack.
Yeah, the main feedback we saw was that just finding a legal place to put a tiny house is the biggest hurdle in Germany.
Why is that?
Well, like anywhere, you can't just build a house wherever you want. But in Germany, many local rules apparently ban residential buildings that aren't connected to public utilities, water, sewage.
So that rules out a lot of potential off-grid spots.
It seems so. It makes finding legal land difficult and potentially expensive because you might need land already zoned and serviced for a regular house.
Even if you find a legal plot, could there still be issues?
Possibly. The plot might be huge, intended for a full-size house, and local interpretations of zoning might still cause problems for a tiny structure.
So challenging overall. Any signs of innovation despite that?
Well, there's the micro-compact home, the MCH. That came out of the Technical University of Munich. It's a very small, high-end living cube.
So interest in small living exists.
Definitely. It shows there's thinking around compact solutions, even if the regulations for typical tiny houses are still quite restrictive in many areas.
Okay, finally, let's look at Turkey. What's the situation there?
Turkey's interesting because right now there's actually no specific official legal regulation just for tiny houses.
Really? None at all.
According to our legal source there, no. Their legal status currently gets figured out by comparing them to existing building laws and zoning rules. It's not clearly defined.
But they're becoming popular there too.
Very much so. Apparently, interest spiked during the pandemic and especially after the recent major earthquake disaster. That's pushed the whole topic into the spotlight.
So change might be coming.
That seems to be the expectation within the legal community in Turkey. They anticipate that some specific regulations for tiny houses will likely be created soon to clarify things. But for now, it's a bit of a gray area legally.
Wow. So Turkey is sort of in a watch this space situation legally. It's incredible how different the approaches are across these places.
It really is stark, isn't it? The U.S. with its local zoning lottery, the U.K. with formal planning and building regs, France with its lightweight habitat focus, Germany's utility connection challenges, and Turkey still developing its framework.
The one constant seems to be, do your homework locally.
Absolutely. That's the #1 takeaway. You have to research the specific rules for the exact area you're interested in. How is a tiny house classified there? ADU, RV, lightweight habitat, something else entirely. That determines everything.
This has been incredibly illuminating. It really shows the complexities behind the simple idea of living smaller.
It does.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about how we define home and how much regulation should shape where and how we choose to live. What's that balance between personal freedom and the rules we need for communities?
That's a great question. Finding that balance is key, and it looks very different depending on where you are.
Indeed. Well, if you found this deep dive into the world of tiny house rules as fascinating as we did, make sure you subscribe to the show. That way you won't miss our future explorations into all sorts of relevant and interesting topics.